Hello again. I wanted to talk today about constructing a ceramic head um, using soft slabs of clay. There are many ways to get to ceramic figures, many techniques, many approaches. This one I find really interesting because you are literally able to construct a form, the architecture of the volume with the minimum amount of clay to describe it, and have a plastic wall that can be pushed back and forth to stretch in and out to create the subforms of the human head. So it holds a lot of nice information from that kind of touch that I think you'll find is really nice to work with, especially around the expression of the human face and the human head. So I like to think of beginning this with the idea of how clothing is constructed in mind. So just like an article of clothing, the language of the ultimate hollow shapes of the clothing start with a two-dimensional language of shapes that we call patterns. So in your soft sheet or slab of clay, you're going to need to start with some 2D shapes that will be domed, you'll stretch volume into the part, and then they'll get sewn together at the edges to help describe this figurative shape we're making. So there are many ways to think of, many different approaches to that as well. So you could imagine by looking at a human skull and looking at the massing of that could be described by many different planes or patterns of clay, maybe 5 or 6, because of the greater massing in the back of the head, the flatness in the front. The jaw is a separate form, so you could imagine that being described with multiple parts. Because of the plasticity and structure of water-based clay, I've reduced it into a more minimal amount of patterns to create the basic architecture that we'll be working with. So to get going, the first thing that I need to think about, or the first thing I do think about, is the neck, actually. And so the neck is we're going to be joining these general shapes together pretty quickly while they still have maximum plasticity, because we want to be able to stretch the real detail and information of the head into these more general shapes. So the first shape I'm thinking about is the pattern of a cylinder, which is a rectangle. So I've pre-cut my slabs. I like to start with about 3/8 of an inch. This is a porcelain clay that I work with. I have a slab roller, so I can roll my slabs out to a very consistent, even thickness, compressed thickness. With constructing anything of slabs, you know, a slab of clay is really reliant on the compression to give it a kind of strength. The plates, those flat plate-like particles of clay under the microscope, get pushed together, and that gives this really flat form its strength. There's no geometry like arching or doming that provides a geometric strength, although these soft slabs can be sort of cast in molds or around molds to give them that geometry for that extra system of structure. So we're going to be doing that as well. So I've made sure these are nicely compressed to 3/8 of an inch. The first step, I always work on what I call a clay work surface, which is just a piece of the same slab. And what that allows for is when I bring my soft sheet up and wrap it into the cylinder, it will grab that bottom edge for support, because often what I'm trying to elevate up vertically is really soft and doesn't have enough structure on its own to support being vertical. So I want to get it up, I want to get it connected with minimal moves and touching, because I also do not want to put weaknesses into the slab by overhandling it when it's wet. A weakness would be where my fingertips grab and gravity stretches and thins it. Remember, we're relying on that even compression to give it a kind of structure, and I want to maintain that as much as I can. So having brought it up into this casual shape of the cylinder, I need to make a seam. And so a seam, of course, could just be a perpendicular cut and then a reconnect by scoring and slipping. I like to cut my seams at a diagonal line from both sides. It creates more surface area in the cut to make and grab like a flap to overlap again. And it just more surface area to keep it together in the movement of the shrinkage. So I'm going to make my cut on a diagonal line all the way down. Okay, so now I have the cut. I would score and slip. I have my scoring tool here. I'm just going to rough up those sections. Add a little liquid clay or slip in there. And then reconnect it. So again, to avoid overhandling with point pressure from fingertips, which of course leaves information and thicks and thins, peaks and valleys, I'm going to really use larger surfaces, and these really flexible plastic ribs are good to help me compress the seam. And I would do the work on the inside as well to compress. Temporarily, that slip clay is really, really weak clay. And so until it stiffens and approaches the same dryness as what I'm attaching, the more plastic clay that's been compressed and drier, it's going to occur like a weakness. So I really want to put compression there because I am going to begin to put stress on that seam very soon. So anything I can do to strengthen it temporarily, I'm going to do. Okay. Okay, so the next kind of thing I would do is I would probably stuff this with newspaper. I have already some newspaper down here. I just keep reusing the same crumpled bits that are smaller. We're creating a kind of internal support for the soft clay so we can put it together really quickly without it collapsing. But we're going to be taking this newspaper out of the form later. So I want it to be in small bits that could emerge with, from the sculpture in the middle of the building of it. Okay, so then this would be on the side, and I would deal with what will become the head part that is attached to the neck. The pattern pieces that I think about when I'm thinking of this way to construct a head are really just two halves. And what would those flat shapes need to be so that when they're domed and then attached as volumetric halves would describe the human head. So I've done it a couple of ways. I've made the seam or the meridian this way with one half holding all of the facial changes and information, architecture of the face, and then a broader kind of volume that would describe the back of the head. I've done it that way, but I came to very quickly wanting to put the seam this way. And by putting the seam this way, I'm able, in the flat pattern shape, to acknowledge the change in volume of the three-dimensional form. So in other words, I can make the curve broader in the back, it can go flatter in the front, it could acknowledge the curve, and then a kind of curve that will allow it to sit in the cylinder. So it really is very useful to think about the egg as a structure at this point, because although we're not exactly making an egg shape for the head, it is going to, in some ways, structurally operate in the same way, which is an egg is domed in every direction. And in that doming and that self-supporting structure of the dome, it has enormous geometric strength. Even though we all know the shell of an egg to be quite thin and fragile, the geometry of the dome allows it to take a lot of external pressure before it cracks. So that's all the geometry. It's not really about the inherent strength of an eggshell. So we want to create a shape that we can put onto this cylinder that will be a head, ultimately be a head that has the integrity of that egg when it's there. So always arching outward, doming outward from the center. So the shape that I have come up with for my two pattern pieces, I've already pre-cut them, But it's really like articulated oval. It's not elongated as a flat shape. It's more like a round shape, a roundish shape that could fit in the proportion of a square. If I make it too elongated, what I will have when I get it volumized is something very thin as a hollow form, like a Modigliani type of head, which is not what I want. So that's the first thing. What I've done is I've cut my shape broader in the back. There is a point where the brow will be right here. This is where all the features will be lined up, so it's a flatter curve. A more slightly accelerated curve where I'll develop the chin, and then an arched form that will sit down in the cylinder. If I don't have arching through this seam, if it goes flat, I will lose structure. It'll be a weaker form when in terms of the self-supporting aspect of it. So the next step is to dome this and use some newspaper as support for the dome that I'm inscribing into the flat shape. So again, I have some newspaper here. I cut them out the same way. I'd cut out one and I laid it on top. I want to make sure that one of them is flipped over. They need to be a mirror image of each other before I dome them. Okay, so that's something I just want to make sure. So I'm going to take newspaper and really just make one smaller ball that can be at the center of the shape to provide support for the highest point of my dome. So once I've done that, I can stretch. I'm just sort of doing this with my fingers from the highest point to arch it to the edge so that it should relax and stretch evenly as possible so that the edges are almost perpendicular to the flat plane that you're working or the work table you're working on. I also want the shape to stay in its original shape. I don't want it to distort at the edge or become kind of like a pie crust. I'm going to really need the edge to maintain that rounded, domed profile as well. So this can take some time, for sure. I might, after establishing the bigger support of the newspaper in the center and doing some arching, I might support the arch to the edge with less newspaper. The newspaper will stay in the halves when I put them together. So it's really helpful after your newspaper support that the edges touch the work surface so you know that it'll come together. It's not overstuffed when you need to bring it together. Okay, so I would do two halves this way. And then it might look kind of like this. Okay, it's not quite as volumetric as half an egg would be, but it's definitely, I'm looking for arching in every direction. I don't want flatness. I need it to be sort of arched. That's very, very important. So I would do both of them, and then there would be some stiffening. So I've come in a little earlier and made some larger, more full-scale parts, and they've been stiffening, so I can just, in cooking show time, jump to the next stage. And so what you're looking for stiffness is not, I'm going to leave it till it becomes leather hard and more rigid and less plastic. I want there to be a kind of a good amount of plasticity because I want to be able to stretch to, once I put it together to really model the human head into these general shapes. So it needs to stretch, it needs plasticity. But yet it needs structure. It can't be super wet. So you're really looking for a smaller window of time, and I like to look at the edge of these shapes and monitor that kind of soft structure I'm looking for. I think of it as being kind of a flabby structure where it's not super stiff, but it has definitely got a little bit of resistance to collapsing there. So how to really test is it's on its bed of newspaper. I would arch my arm and I would support the arch of this half, turn it over and watch the edges. If the edges stay up and they don't tend toward collapsing, I'm probably in a position where I could bring this together as that egg-like head form. So what I would think of doing next is make sure there's enough newspaper in there. Okay, just filling that in. So one thing that I didn't talk about that's very helpful is once I've taken the flat shape and I've arched it, I would go back in with something like this really soft plastic rib, and I would flex it to match the curve of this half, and I would gently, in multiple directions, compress it now as an arched shape. Essentially, those particles were flat, and then you stretch them and they've changed, and now I'm going to lock them in with compression again. It gives it a kind of strength as a new shape, which I'm really interested in. I do not want this to collapse. If something that was flat, like a soft slab was flat, I arch it, I let it stiffen a little bit, and then it flattens again in my handling of it, and I think, oh, I'll just re-arch it. I've immediately got a weaker form. You can think of clay as having a memory, and so how the clay would remember that flattening is it's sort of like, I like to think of it as when you're trying to tear a piece of paper in a straight line and you don't have scissors. So you fold it back and forth, and then the fibers are weakened. It sort of remembers the folding as a weakness, so it can be torn in a fairly straight line. This clay will have that same memory. So you definitely want to be careful about handling it so that it flattens, because it just won't have the structure you need when you need it. Okay, so what's next would be, I'm going to score and slip these edges. Now instead of risking it flattening or that sort of flexing that could be encoded like memory in here, I'm going to keep it right side up and just go up under the edge with my scoring tool, which is a serrated metal rib. And I'm cross-hatching. Again, the goal of scoring is to reveal moisture, a softer center inside of the drier skin of where air has been drying this. And that will be a better way to marry the two halves, is with the maximum amount of water. Okay, so I'm going to do this one. I'm going to do the other one that I've set up. Little bits of paper are likely to fall out. It's okay. This could be, this is a large enough scale that, there are just some physical awkwardnesses that can be a part of the process for sure. Okay, so I have my slip and my brush, so I'm just going to really butter up these edges. That will help transition them and provide a bond to make my closed egg form. Okay, I might do the other one as well. Okay. So now what I use next as I put this together, again, the goal is not overhandling this to weaken it while I'm trying to connect it. So that's a little bit of a tricky thing. And I've done hundreds of pieces this way, so my hands are pretty smart to it, and you're going to see there's always a little struggle. So, this is hard won touching, so hang in there. But what I usually have to work with is a piece of foam rubber as a work surface. I have one right here. And what this allows for, you're going to see, as I'm sort of trying to keep these soft halves arched and attach them at the edges, this is a kinder surface, so I'm not flattening things as I'm working. So I would recommend this some kind of surface like this foam rubber provides for your process. Okay, so now these two shapes were actually cut very specifically to represent volume. So I want to line them up so that they fit. I have to remember, I think this was mine this way. Okay, so I line them up and then I turn them on the side right away. So I'm not putting weight on this one arched half that can collapse it. I'm going to hold it and let gravity work like on the seam. So I move down to the foam. I'm trying not to rest the full weight of this on the foam because it'll flatten, but it's there. It's sort of gently there. My fingertips are at the seam, and that's where all the action of joining will be. Pushing in. And I'm kind of compressing the seam as I'm joining. If a little newspaper gets caught in the seam, it's okay. So I don't want to make a flap at the seam. I want to join them end to end. So you can see it's not always, takes a little patience. Okay, so you can see this is what happened. I got a pillow-like shape. Not too bad. It's really oddly flat right here on the top, but that's okay. So this is what I envisioned. I have my cylinder. Just pull this over. Let's see. My stuffed cylinder is here. So you can see this is going to sit down like this. This shape here is meant to be where the eyes, the nose, the mouth will be. This will be, you know, I can correct this angle when I get inside of there. The broadness is for the back, and this curve is what's going to support it in the cylinder of the neck. Okay, so now, before I start thinking of attaching this, I'm going to do some work with a paddle. And this allows me to make a correction to the profile a little bit. It's allowing me to give more compression to that seam from the outside, which is very important. It needs to stay together. I'm also working on this very flat and pillow-like shape at the seam to make it look less like a seam. I'm kind of making it a little more dimensional there. It's a little bit flatter than I would like, but I think it'll be okay. So I can see already that my neck diameter is much greater than I need. So I'm going to just put my shape down here. When I rest it on the foam, I prop it so that it's on the seam, not on one of what used to be a half, because even though there's newspaper to support it, it's more likely to flatten under gravity on that side versus the seam. So I just sort of let it be there. So what I want is for this cylinder to be able to grab, oops, spilled water everywhere, be able to grab this sort of head-like form, the sort of egg-like form, with no space between them on the side, okay? So I can see, I think I can show you. If I did this, there's a substantial amount of space on either side of this. So I need to cut down this cylinder to a little more. I'm going to take a section out and then reconnect it. Okay. See if that stays. Okay, so I have my knife. No. Okay, this is not. Okay, I think that's going to stay now. So I'm going to go back where I made the initial seam on this, which is right here. I'm going to cut out, just kind of cut a section out. I'm cutting at an angle again. Okay. It's going to need me to take the newspaper out because it's about to be narrower, so that won't fit. I'm going to reposition it, score and slip again. It's not really connected to the base, but if it had connected, I would have sliced it with a wire to release it so I could move this. Reconnect. Take my rib. I'm putting compression in that seam without putting any kinds of weaknesses with my fingertips. And I will do some action on the inside to really compress it as well. Okay, let me take a look now. Okay, I think it's going to be okay. I don't want to make it. So now what I'm going to do is, before attaching the egg, so to speak, to the cylinder, I'm going to restuff. Again, the newspaper will come out in the middle, but right now I just need it to be able to support the egg, so I need the structure the newspaper will provide. So now what I'm going to do is, when you look at the side of a human head, you know, there's a common design to all human heads, and of course there are aspects that are unique to each individual human. So one of the common design features is that the neck comes up higher to support the larger volume of the back of the head, and it comes up lower to catch the jaw. So we're going to start, in a general terms, by making an angled cut in the cylinder before attaching that. So wherever you determine the back of this neck is, that's the highest point. I almost always envision where I cut the cylinder, the seam in the front, as the front. It just has more gesture and it feels that way to me usually. So this is the back. So I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to cut at an angle to the lower point, directly opposite of the high point, and then bring it back up. I'm cutting at an angle like this so that what I essentially have in the neck is an egg cup to receive the egg. There'll be a shared surface there to connect to the shape of the head. So I'm going to start high here. I'm cutting down. Oops. To the lowest. Now I'm going to bring it up to the highest again. Okay. So this is what we're going to be connecting in. Okay, something like that. It's still a little bit wide. So I am going to take out just a little more. I don't want to change the convexity of the cylinder by pushing it in to fit, because I lose the structure. I need it to be outward and arched for structure. So that's why I'm going through all these steps. I'm just going to take a little bit more out. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is, I made an arrow cylinder. I'm sure it'll be fine. Now what I'm going to do is score where I cut that angled cut and add a healthy amount of slip in there. Okay, so placement in the neck. I want to make, I know this is all very crash test dummy and, you know, general and kind of comical, but these general shapes, you know, will be stretched into more representations. It's the fun part, it's coming up. But anyway, this brow line represents where I envisioned all the features below: the eyes, the nose, the mouth, all in this sort of shallow curve. I want to make sure this curve is parallel to the neck. You may, in your attempt to make a space between what we're calling the neck and this part we might call the chin, you might say, oh, I need more space there, so I'm going to angle this way. Don't do that, okay? It's going to really limit your ability to stretch into this and have it work out okay. So I really want to make sure that curve is perpendicular to that curve. If you need more space here, there are other things we can do once we get along to make additions there to make that okay. Okay, so I've centered it in the cylinder. I want to make sure that it's, you know, as I need it to be there. So now what I'm going to do is I work on a banding wheel. Just allows me to turn and work a little more easily. Back to my rib, my plastic rib. I'm going to, at this seam, I'm going to take the point of the rib and I'm going to just really compress up. I'm bringing some of that soft clay from the neck up into, and really put, you know, pressure there to start to join the head form to the neck form. Any proportional changes that we want to make, we will be able to make darts or removals and re-stretch across those negative spaces to make changes to the three-dimensional form. Very similar to the tailoring of a piece of clothing, where you remove material and you recut it or re-stretch it across that opening to make a change to, you know, you lost weight, so we got to take the waist in, you know, it's like that. Okay, not terrible. So this is where I'm going to stop this part. Normally what I would do in my real-time process is I would probably let this have some time to stiffen at the seams a little bit. So because one of the next stages is a lot of stress on the seams, because I'm going to be stretching from within the shape outward and from without the shape, from outside of the shape inward to into the hollowness. So the seams are going to get a workout. So I really want them to kind of gel and get a little stronger through drying. So I would just wrap this like a skin with a lightweight plastic, so there's no air between the plastic, airspace between the plastic and the object, just like a second skin. And then let it overnight, just kind of have some time. Come back in the next day and do what I'll part 2, okay, which we'll do in another video segment. Okay, so this is the end of part 1, and part 2 will be coming along, and we'll start to make this look like a head. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.